called the National Energy Market. It's also more colloquially called just the National Energy Grid. The states of Tasmania, South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, ACT, I should say territory of ACT, and Queensland are all connected via transmission infrastructure. So when you plug something into the wall in Victoria, it's actually effectively synchronised with someone who's also in Queensland. It's the biggest national grid in the world, actually, in terms of geographic reach, but also one of the sparsest. Now, because it's quite sparse, and because it requires augmentation, and for a whole lot of reasons, getting energy from the national grid actually gets more and more expensive every year, which is no secret to any of you who have received electricity bills, because you'll notice that your bills go up every year even if you use the same amount. At the same time, other ways of using energy that don't involve the national grid, such as solar panels and battery storage, and other types of renewables and alternatives to using more electricity like efficiency, are actually coming down in price. Now, you don't have to be a mathematician to work out that if the cost of energy on the grid keeps going up and the cost of energy off the grid keeps going down, eventually one of them is eventually going to cross, if they haven't already. So Energy for the People and ATA decided we really wanted to know when that's going to cross, and so we applied for some funding from the Consumer Advocacy Panel, and they said okay, and gave us some money to go and research that. That's a short story. Consumer Advocacy Panel, by the way, also funds my day-to-day role with the ATA as a commissioner. We're lucky enough to have a guest visit by one of the former ATA consumer advocates here as well. So what did we do? Now, again, as I said, please fire questions as we go.
Just since last meeting with you, Craig, actually the service charge I've noticed has gone up from 80 cents to 130 cents. I don't know, I got that from my retailer the other day, but maybe for the track, and I went back and I've since put it to the MPs, my local MP and various things. I just said that's a 67% increase. It's just phenomenal.
So that's actually a really good point. The point is regarding how we pay for energy. Now, it's not just that it gets more expensive to supply people on the grid. Another thing that's changing is how the energy businesses actually recoup those costs. So traditionally, most of what you get on your bill has been a volume-based charge. So the more kilowatt hours you use, the more you pay. The fewer kilowatt hours you use, the less you pay. There's also a fixed charge component, which is the daily charge that doesn't matter how much or how little you use. Increasingly, it looks like, or increasingly we know, that that daily charge has been going up more than the volumetric charge. So even if you reduce your energy use, your bills still can go up because of that. Now, there's further changes in trade, which I won't go into now, but they mean that there might be new ways of charging introduced as well, where people pay based on their peak demand, which would actually be more reflective of the cost of supplying off the grid. And although things are in train there, there's a lot of political will to not drive up the impact of bills on some people, so that's not something that's going to be introduced in a big hurry, but it's certainly on the horizon, possibly as an option. So the key point in relation to this work is that when you look at energy efficient homes that use less energy, the more that fixed charge goes up, the more incentive that there is for people to actually go off the grid instead, because the fixed charge of building an off-grid system is directly related to how much energy you're going to use, because the fixed cost of an off-grid system is really very capital based. And so it's quite a relevant observation, really, that the economics of the way that we've studied this are based on the cost of supplying consumers. It hasn't made a distinction on the basis of how people are paying for energy. But if you're looking at smaller clusters of homes and consumers initiating doing what I'm about to describe themselves, then things like having more fixed charges on bills will change the dynamics of that quite a lot.
Yeah, well, that's a really significant sunken cost there and then.
Yeah, it is. It means if like homes like me, if you use 4 kilowatt hours a day, all of a sudden your fixed charges are pretty much almost as much as your volume-based charges. So we considered what would be involved in actually taking a community off the grid and saying, Well, if it's going to cost you this much to supply your energy being on the grid, what's it going to cost to supply it off the grid? What are the options? And to do that, we did a very detailed design process of a standalone microgrid system. What does that mean? Well, that means that in the example of the modelling that we did, we took 500 homes. We didn't really take 500 homes and do this. We just did this in a computer, okay? So we took 500 homes and we said, all right, well, we're going to not give them a connection to the mains grid, like homes normally do for new estates and existing communities, and we'll build an integrated poles and wires based system, and that community will be effectively self-sustaining in its energy use.
Sorry, Craig, you mean 500 homes together or 500
Yep.
scattered homes?
That's a good question. Together, geographically co-located, so they could all be plugged into the same system.
A mini grid, effectively.
Yeah, mini grid. Now, I like the term mini grid, but we've all decided to use the term standalone mini grid because distributors, I found out, can't divorce themselves from the idea that a mini grid's not actually connected to their grid that they recoup revenue from. So, just to really emphasise the point, we're calling it a standalone mini grid, as in none of your business, Mr. Distributor. Yep.
Yeah, one of the issues about distribution is that I believe that you're not allowed to sell power across a property line.
That's a good point. Yep. It's an electrical safety rule as much as a distribution rule. It gets into a very murky area called embedded networks and private networks. And there's jurisdictional rules about that, and every state's a bit different. We're currently looking to rationalise those rules by making them nationally consistent. And like everything else in the energy market that we do to make it nationally consistent, it will probably take 10 years to do that. And until that happens, in some states you can, in theory, as long as you don't sell energy to the person who you're supplying energy to. What that means is that you can't have a contract with them that says, you know, I'll buy this amount of energy from you or sell you this amount of energy at this price. Doesn't mean that you can't just, as long as it's electrically safe, which an extension lead isn't, chuck an extension lead over their fence and gift it to them. So it is complicated, but yeah, generally speaking, it's certainly not straightforward or in some cases legal to just supply direct energy over the fence. So we chose. Yeah, one more question before we move on.
Yeah,
yep.
a couple of things. Firstly, I think there's a limitation to voltage on that. If you supply the voltage if you measure the voltage as it crosses the boundary, I think it's below 12 volts. I'm not sure that they are involved. And secondly, there's no reason why energy can't be passed through a fence by a rotating shaft in the middle of a Jenny motor, by the way.
So that's an interesting point. So the first point, you very correctly identified that I'm talking about mains electricity there when I say that you can't do it, 240 volts, but you only have to be competent, not qualified, to provide extra low voltage electricity, which is under, 110 volts DC and 48 AC. And you could do that over a fence, maybe conceivably also as long as you're not selling it. Or, as you say, you could pass that energy through an emotive way by any number of manners, any number of ways, including having a generator, doing a Newton and dropping apples on your neighbour's head and gravity being imparted on them.
Hydraulic lines.
All sorts of ways that you could do it if you were circumventing electricity. And I'm sure many ATA members have thought of, if not done, half of those things. So I'm going to move on. Now, so we chose 3 locations to do our study, and the importance of choosing these locations was understanding 2 things: the climate, the cost of energy. This is 3 things: the climate, the cost of energy, and I've forgotten the 3rd thing now. But it was oh yeah, sorry. The type of community that we're actually taking off the grid and the business case for doing so. So the first.
What about the type of generation for your own? Is it, are you purely looking at PV? Or
Yeah, we'll come to that. So it's a good question. So what we, in choosing the different locations, we chose a Werribee type new estate. So we've got 500 homes, it's a greenfield connection, there's no existing electrical connection. We chose Preston because it's in an urban area that's well established and it's got homes in it and a well established electricity grid that exists. And we chose an estate or a new development in a regional centre, in this case somewhere near Bendigo. Now we did this to get a diversity of baseline energy prices, because those are different areas with different, supplied by different utilities, so there's different prices for energy. There's some slight climate differences, but the reason that we chose to make them all in Victoria was because we wanted to understand what effectively the worst case is. The reason for that is if it works in Victoria, it's going to work anywhere, because we've got much cheaper energy from the grid and we've got a much crappier solar resource than much of the rest of Australia. So that was the reason behind us choosing the worst case. A few people have said, why don't you look at it in New South Wales or Queensland where it's more likely to work? Well, that's the whole point. If we identify that it can work here, then we can prove that it can work anywhere. Now, at the same time, we did research that continues on, plenty of research that we've already done before, which is looking at individual homes, taking individual homes off grid. And I'm not going to go into the conclusions of that because we've only got 1 hour, not 2. We can talk about that if we've got time in the end. But I'll just say that ATA has done a bit of research for this over time, particularly, forever. ATA has its origins in members who 30 odd years ago have their own off-grid power systems, and that's a large part of ATA's reason for existence. In more recent years, and just in my involvement with ATA, I sat on the Bushfire Power Line Safety Task Force a few years ago to advise our Premier and Energy Minister on ways of dealing with bushfire safety. One of the things that we were proposing is, well, if you're looking at doing expensive stuff like undergrounding all the power lines, why don't you look at doing something that's a bit cheaper and delivers better outcomes for consumers, like for those really long power lines, rather than undergrounding them, give people free off-grid power systems. For some reason that I'll never fully understand, the distribution businesses didn't like the idea of their regulated asset bases being eroded by people being given off-grid power systems and free energy. So that idea didn't really apply. But nonetheless, we've done a fair bit of research on that ourselves, and we've actually found, just for example, that if you need to spend about, the number's changing, but just ballpark $20,000 or $30,000 on upgrading a bit of network for a consumer. And that means that if you've got a power line that is supplying 10 different consumers, that number becomes 300,000 or 400,000. If you're going to spend that much money, you're better off, and they are better off, and all other consumers are better off because they're no longer paying for that extra bit of infrastructure, giving those consumers standalone power systems instead. So, and those economics are constantly tipping in the scale of tipping towards single homes going off grid. Now, when we look at a 500 home scenario, what we end up with is the benefits of scale. And at that scale, what we've found is it actually tips fully in favour of actually using the off-grid option, which is pretty exciting. So what does our 500 home microgrid look like? Well, it actually doesn't look a great deal, doesn't look too dissimilar to what you would look like. You know, you wouldn't pick it driving down the street in one of these communities, aside from the fact that there'd be solar panels plastered on a lot more roofs than you see at the moment. Of the 500 homes, basically, they're all connected with poles and wires that don't look necessarily any different to the normal poles and wires you have in the street. If it's an existing network, like in the case of using the Preston 500 home community, you just use the existing poles and wires, disconnected at a substation or a certain strategic switch point, and have a community garden at the substation instead. It wouldn't be a great deal of difference in the actual infrastructure. For a greenfield site, you can be a bit more creative. You can underground all the poles and wires. Oh, don't underground the poles. You can underground the wires and not have to look at your electricity system at all. Or you could just have poles and wires, have a community owned and managed poles and wires scheme. Paint the poles whatever colour you like. There's all sorts of options.
Should we have a lower voltage system?
What's that?
Would it be lower voltage?
Good question. At 500 homes, you can get away with making it 240 volts all the way. If you have a much bigger system, if you've got a lot more geographical a lack of geographical proximity, there might be a benefit to stepping up the voltage level. Certainly 500 homes, we just go with 240 or 415 volts.
Is that then, so, I mean, you're basically looking at a centralised system and then dropping off then, or if you basically embedded systems the way through, then that would be too effective, wouldn't it?
I'll get to that,
Yeah,
kind of.
okay.
If that question's not answered in the next
Sure.
3 hours, then ask it.
Would that accommodate three-phase power?
Yeah, that's the 415. So you'd probably have a combination of, actually, I'd probably have to get back to you on that one, on what the best balance is. And that would need one of our electricians to actually talk about delta winding versus star windings and all sorts of things. But I'd say, yeah, but yes, 3 phase is fine. Sure.
You could make a simple rule to say domestic, there's no 3 phase, there's no industrial occupation.
Yeah, so in the,
Technically, no domestic home needs it.
yeah. So what we did assume that it was single phase. However, we can use 3 phase generators and have them separated out into separate phases for our backup generators. And you can have inverters on different phases of circuits and so on, if there's a desire to have a centralised 3 phase load for the backup generators. So yeah, I'll try and avoid getting too complicated on that, or we don't have time before I get out of my depth. In terms of the homes themselves, obviously one of the key ingredients for this was solar panels. We considered realistic placement of solar panels in all of our locations, and that meant considering, well, if you've got a place like an existing Preston-based community, you need to consider the existing issues of shading from established trees and so on, the fact that the houses aren't that big, the fact that there's a fair bit of development. And we did find that was a constraint in terms of getting enough solar panels on enough roofs to provide enough energy without having to put solar panels on the south-facing side of the homes and the front fence and the dog and all of that stuff. So, but in the cases that I'm about to describe, we could do that. I'll get on to the cases where there just physically wasn't enough room for solar panels. What we decided in each of the cases was that 450 of the homes in the 500 community has solar panels on them, ranging from a couple of kilowatts up to I think 7 or 8, before we decided that not enough homes are going to be able to easily accommodate that before there's additional costs. The reason for leaving 10% of them without solar panels was because we assumed we want to make this analysis credible for policymakers, as much as we'd like to say, yeah, put solar panels on all of them, but by leaving 10% of them without solar panels, they can still get their energy from the rest of the system and just be passive energy users if they don't want to participate. So if, for example, you were to go into Preston and say, hey, we're all going to go green and take our community off the grid, we're allowing, at least for some people, saying, look, I'm quite happy just to buy energy from the grid and get bills, I don't want a part of it. So in that case, those consumers can do that. They don't have solar panels on their roof. We're allowed for that. Yep.
So are the homeowners with solar, the 90% actually buying their own solar panels?
No.
They're provided by the
There's different ways it could work, but the way that we're assuming it would work is that all the homeowners are just paying bills the way that they normally would.
Okay.
I'll get on to the business model
sure.
at the end.
Yeah.
But you raise an important point. None of the homeowners have to go out and actually purchase these under the business model that we've used. It's a financing arrangement which would involve an ESCO or an energy services company actually buying the technology and installing it. One more question before I move on.
At the moment, all the 500 houses in Preston would be connected by the same wires, including the 10% that aren't going to be part of the standalone grid. How do they get separated?
Well, they don't. The whole grid, I mean, if you picture those 500 homes as a network of homes, they've got a common point of connection on the distribution network, which would probably be somewhere on the 22 kV line if it's in Victoria. That will be disconnected at that point on the 22 kV line, and from that point on, all their energy comes from within that same network. So those homes that aren't actually connected to the mains grid are still connected to the energy that's being generated from the other homes.
So 10% who don't participate still are people just get free energy from
not necessarily free, but they might be, so they'll be paying for it still, but it means that they don't have to change their behaviour. They don't have to buy into in a community, you're always going to get people who dissent from a decision, and that's perfectly fair enough. And there's a lot of people who, I say this as a consumer advocate, there's a lot of people who couldn't give a rat's about environmental
Okay, so the
things.
standalone grid still provides power to the people who notionally aren't.
Does.
Okay.
Yep, so they just go on paying. Well, the difference for them is that they wouldn't be able to choose an energy retailer like they can now. So at the moment on grid, you can choose an energy retailer. You know, if you can find them, the best of the bad bunch that's actually worth going with. It's pretty hard to do so. Under this arrangement, those 50 homes who aren't voluntarily participating in this program, they wouldn't be able to choose a retailer. So for this to actually work, they need to be getting energy that's no more expensive than what they would from the retailer they're getting anyway. Otherwise, the Australian Energy Regulator and the Australian Energy Market Commission and the Energy Ministers of Australia would never approve this actually occurring. So we need to make sure we've got a robust case for the consumers who aren't interested in doing all that green stuff. So 450 of the homes have solar panels. Now the obvious question then is energy storage, because you need a lot of it. Now we did a lot of research into looking at different types of energy storage available. Obviously batteries are the way to go. What was interesting we found is that lithium iron phosphate are now the most cost-effective batteries to use for energy storage on that scale. These are batteries that are currently used in electric vehicles. They're available. They're not some future technology that's going to happen. They're not waiting to drop by 90% in price. We've based it on what's available now. And under our design, about 1 in every 5 to 1 in every 7 homes, approximately, 1 in 5 to 1 in every 8 homes has a large lithium-ion battery bank in it. In terms of size, off the top of my head, the battery bank might be, I don't know, maybe as big as this interactive modern lectern thing, maybe a little bit bigger. So I think it's pretty fair to say that between 5 to 7 homes, you'd be able to find a space for something like that that wouldn't really compromise the real estate value of the home. You know, either in an outdoors area where it's in a box, or in a shed, or under a home, or whatever.
How many kilowatt hours per each battery?
Each bank's got 120 kilowatt hours of storage.
So just a quick one. Your pricing on this, is this basic retailer pricing, or would this be bulk buying like across the whole
Yep,
greenfields?
that's a good question. It sort of ties in with the model, but it's all based on the equipment being purchased at a wholesale price, and the ESCO who's selling the energy and buying the services making a profit on the whole package, rather than having a profit margin on the supply chain all the way along. And that's one of the keys to this model working. If you look at the way the energy market works at the moment, you've got notionally disaggregation of retail and generator functions in the energy market, but really they're aggregated. They are disaggregated from the network operations of transmission and distribution, which in turn are disaggregated from each other. Now, that means that there's 4 different entities that you pay profit margins to by the time your electricity bill arrives. So under this model, for it to actually work economically, it needs to be delivered by one vertically integrated ESCO entity. And that's the only single innovation that this whole finding is reliant on, is that business entity comes into being, because at the moment they don't. All the technology assumptions are made based on existing technology. All of the price assumptions are made based on current prices with conservative forecasts for price curves. The only assumption that we've made about something that is new would be that the business would have to actually offer these services. But it would be a profitable service for them to offer with the rate of growth.
Are any of the existing energy retailers thinking about moving into this area?
So the question is, are any existing energy retailers thinking about moving into this area? Most of the energy retail It's controlled by a very small number of energy retailers. There's the big three, AGL, Energy Australia and Origin, who have got 70 or 80% of customers in states that have got established competitive retail, and even larger portions in states that have less established competitive retail. And in most states there's about another 10 or so retailers. All of them, except for the very smallest ones, are vertically integrated with generation infrastructure. What that means is that those retailers have hedged basically their investments by saying, all right, well, we've got all these consumers we need to supply. We don't want to be exposed to the volatile spot prices on the national energy market to a high extent. So we'll purchase this here coal-fired power station and that wind farm over there and this gas plant and this hydro station, so that the generation costs that they're exposed to are also the retail prices that they're exposed to. What that means is that retailers hate it when people use less energy, and they hate it when people use energy that doesn't come from large centralised generators that they own. This is why some of you might have seen in the last few days we've had an outgoing energy minister in Victoria mumbling about reducing about the impact of the energy efficiency target, because we've got large businesses who actually push back against anything that reduces the consumption of energy from the grid. The retailers and the distributors both do that, the retailers in particular, because they're the ones who are currently facing large losses because they've invested in overcapacity generation. I could go on, but and usually I do, but the key thing to bear in mind there is that retailers are a very long way from being of a mentality or even having a business imperative to get behind this. So you might find a boutique retailer getting into it, but it's also quite different to retailers' core business. It involves owning and buying technology and networks and stuff that they're not used to. So my guess is if this comes from anywhere in the future, it certainly won't be it won't be a large retailer, and it probably won't be an existing retailer.
Okay. I believe Horizon Power in WA is looking at this because they have a lot of isolated communities that aren't on a strict grid. And
this is what Horizon Power's networks are like, they're mini grids, but Horizon Power are locked into long-term contracts to buy diesel. So even though they've got a lot of sites that have got huge cost of supply of energy and really good solar resource, they're a bit hamstrung when it comes to investing in what is really a logical investment, batteries and solar, to reduce their supply costs. They also, Horizon Power also get paid, well, consumers on Horizon Power's network are directly subsidised by consumers on the grid that includes Perth. So that's because the government is trying to maintain consistent pricing across those. So Horizon Power aren't actually exposed to the cost of more expensive ways of generating energy. So
at a recent conference they recognised that that model is not going to work in the future and they had to change their model.
Yep. You hear
so
that
as
a
those
lot.
contracts die out, I guess they could swap over to this model.
Yep, and that's what will happen. But they'll wait for the contracts to die out, even if it's a more expensive option to do that. Even if they'd be better off today paying out a penalty on those contracts and building in solar and batteries, which I think that they would be, they still wouldn't do it. And they're slow to move. They've also just had a massive downsize of anyone who's involved in being innovative. Horizon has been given a voluntary redundancy. So, you know, it's that's a bit of an exaggeration, but that's the direction that it's going in. They are very, very slow to move, the networks. And they've been stung by things. In fairness to the networks, they've also been stung by, you know, otherwise good ideas recoiling. So, for example, the Victorian smart meter rollout, which could have been a good idea if it was done properly a few years later when the technology had matured and all of the consumer protections have been put in place first, was a disaster. And it's created a bad rap for something that would otherwise have revolutionised the Australian energy market. And that's not the fault of the distributors, it's the fault of the particular government that jumped the gun and went ahead with it too quickly. You had a question,
Yeah.
and then I'll have one more before we move on, just because again, I want to get through some key things. We will have more time for questions.
I'm from East Gippsland, and I'm aware that Malakuta, because it's on the end of the line, and because of the amount of outage it has, that they're looking seriously at local networks.
Well, Malakuta is an interesting case. So SP AusNet, yes, they've looked at that, but with all the concerns that having a local network there that's completely isolated from the distribution grid would mean reducing the bit. You see, energy businesses make money out of owning and financing poles and wires. So if they've got a length of sub-transmission line servicing Malakuta, for example, which they do, there's 70 odd Ks of one voltage and 30 Ks of another or something like that, then they have an interest in keeping that going. They have a very strong interest in, rather than looking at a local grid, spending money replacing that line itself. There's a lot of challenges that are in their way that mean that they're not going to do what we're talking about here. One of those is there are ring fencing provisions required for distributors to get around being able to, the inability to sell energy to consumers, because they're actually separated from the sale of energy. They just provide services for the throughput of energy. That would all have to change for them to actually sell energy to consumers if consumers were to be sustained off the network for an extensive period of time. So what they'll probably do, what they will do in Malakuta, is they'll put in a few local generators. I think they're putting in a local pad or two for temporary generators that will be there during the holiday season when they peak. Unfortunately, they're not going to do what would be in the best interest of all consumers on SP AusNet's network, which would be to disconnect the supply to Malakuta and have it be completely standalone with batteries and solar and diesel backup. Question there?
When you're talking about a greenfield site, is it worth your getting in touch with developers who are maybe going to start up a whole new suburb and say, why don't you go from scratch and make it off-grid to begin with? Is that feasible?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Some developers have an interest in developing in sustainable developments. Some are more focused on volume of homes and see compliance with anything that looks like a sustainability measure is just a boring thing that they have to do to get their rubber stamp. But yeah, definitely, I'd say there's an opportunity there for developers to, tap into that interest that people have to be not only environmentally sustainable but self-sustaining as a community.
They've done that out, they see risk.
Yeah, I'll squeeze in that one last question before I carry on.
Okay.
Yep. So
just following on to that, I've been to a few meetings with Sibelco and Willydale will be progressively over the next maybe 10 years building about 4,000 odd homes into an existing site, which is now the mining site, with getting out all your Willydale toppings and various other things in Willydale. And that's what I suggested right at the start, to say why do we make this a solar city or renewable total resource the whole area through the estate.
Yep.
And just everybody said what? Not, So anyway, I'm still progressing that.
It's not.
Have you had any contact with Sibelco at all?
No. Okay. It's not how a lot of people think either. The majority of people have been passive energy users for a long time and will remain that way for quite a while. But also, what is a passive energy user, changes in definition, because people naturally become more aware of those things, and more people are taking on solar and so on because it's just a sensible thing to do from an economic perspective. So I think with time, you will see that this will be supported enough to create enough demand for developers like that to listen. And it probably takes people like yourself actually pointing it out to them at this stage to plant that seed and get the idea moving. So don't, it'll be frustrating because a lot of them, what I do know of, there's one project I can't talk about because it's confidential, but there's a developer in New South Wales who's, let's say they're looking at this and looking at it seriously. The motivation that they have is if they build a new connection to a new site, they're going to have to spend $250,000 upgrading a local network, or 25 million or 250,000, I can't remember. A big enough number for them to consider alternative options. I mean, at 25 million for the 1,000 homes or whatever it is they're looking at connecting, it would just be an absolute no-brainer to go off grid instead. If it is 2,000, if it is 250,000, then it's still probably cheaper for them to do the grid option now. I'm going to press on. So again, questions as we go is fine, but let's just have a 30-second break with no questions. So most of our energy is coming from solar. We've got batteries for storage, and we've also got 2 or 3 big stinking diesel generators to blow some smoke out for those days when there's just not enough solar and the energy demand exceeds our needs. Now there are other options. Those in our design, we have made those diesel generators completely biodiesel ready. So if there's a source of biodiesel that can be used, then that's great. However, for our costing, we've assumed that they're run on diesel, and the reason for that is we're not using them very often. They're only infrequent. Yes, diesel has particulate emissions, which mean generators have to be located somewhere where they're away from homes. Yes, that means that it's probably untenable for Preston, and Preston would need to have a biodiesel option or potentially a gas generator option, which would be more expensive. Those are all considerations, but what we're focused on there is having a plausible supply of energy with generators that are real and that would be accepted generally in the context of the location. And on that basis, we found that biodiesel-ready diesel generators were okay. Now, they're centralised, so whereas the energy storage and solar generation is located in homes, the diesel generators in our modelling are centralised. You could probably have them in the middle of the community garden that you turn the old substation into, or something like that if you're buying back the grid. Or if it's a new development that's somewhere out in a urban fringe area, you have your diesel generators away from homes in an area of parkland or at the other side of the area of parkland or something. We also assumed that we've got some smart control of battery charging and smart energy use. So that means included in all the costs are, having not just accumulation meters on the wall, but some smart meters that monitor people's energy and that avoid a bit of energy use during peak times by shifting it to off-peak times automatically rather than just relying on behaviour change. But we don't have a lot of that. The model doesn't need a lot of peak shifting, because what's interesting about microgrids and standalone power supplies is that they're not as vulnerable to the impacts of peak demand as the national energy grid is. So there's not as much of a cost benefit from shifting a certain amount of load, because the way to address a peak issue, the only real peak constraint at all in our microgrids is the capacity of the inverters. Because we're using lithium iron phosphate batteries, they have none of the issues that lead acid batteries have in terms of depth of discharge or rate of discharge. So, depth of discharge they have a limit, but not as much as lead acid batteries. And so the constraint for peak power provision is in the inverter capacity, and an inverter that provides a lot more capacity is only a tiny bit more expensive. So we've just assumed that we've built in some nice big, slightly over-spec'd inverters in the first instance. That means there's not much benefit to shifting load from peak times to off-peak times. So there's a little bit of load smarts in there, but not a great deal is needed.
We're basically talking about the benefits of diversity here, and one of the things that you didn't mention is whether there was any industrial or other kinds of non-domestic users in your micro network to provide a bit of diversity in the load.
It's a really good question. We've assumed just residential, and we've cheated a bit and assumed that, like any area that's got 500 residences, there might be a milk bar or something in there as well. But we did consider doing it a bit more robustly and saying, all right, what if we have more of a community? So we'll have a school, we'll have some shops, might have a local community building of some description. we stuck to the residences because it was a bit easier, basically, and it didn't really upset the business case a lot to say, all right, well, what if one of those consumers is using 50 kilowatt hours a day because they're a local shopping store? You know, that's all just a case of expanding the whole system. So it was easier for us to do our load profiling, our modelling and our design to just use residential. And the sensitivity analysis that we did showed that, I mean, if you went and slapped a school in there, obviously it would need a completely different design to what we've done, or a bigger version of what we've done. But for the case of residential supply only, that's what we're stuck with.
But there was no, it seems like you had no issue with the business of different consumers using significantly different amounts of load at different times of the day. You just, with the battery you're talking about, that didn't matter, is that right?
So yeah, that's a good question. So the constraints that we've got in terms of supplying energy are the peak delivery constraint, as in the instantaneous maximum amount of power constraint. It's not in the poles or wires or the batteries, it's in the inverter size. And so we've got that well sized. The longer term constraint is in seasonal variations and periods of not much solar input in winter. So that's when the generators, backup generators, need to run through. That's part of where some of the smarts is. It's sensing when the batteries are near the level of charge that the generators are going to have to run, so that you only run the generators during, for example, daytime hours, so they're not disturbing people's sleep. In terms of the diversity of the load, though, we didn't need to explore that to too much of an extent across the residential basis. Yeah, because even if we assumed that they all switched everything on at once, which we didn't, but even if we assumed that they did. Oh, sorry, there's another point there that's really important that I forgot about. We've actually used real load data for 500 homes in Preston. So we actually got hold of some data from a project, I can't remember the source of the project, but it used real data. It was averaged across, I don't know, 1,000 homes or something, and we just halved that or whatever it was. So, and we actually manipulated that particular data source to make different load profiles for the other locations as well. So in that regard, that's already diversified.
Yes.
Before it even gets to us. So a few hands are up now. Can I ask you to hold off for questions until I get through 2 more points, and then we'll take those questions. And first question is just from someone who hasn't asked any questions yet. So the other thing that we included was, especially for the existing homes, some home efficiency improvements. So obviously when you're connected to the grid, like most of us are, you've got less of an imperative to be energy efficient than if you're off grid. Now, a lot of existing homes are of poor quality. I think the average housing stock's something in the order of 2 stars. So I think we assumed that we'd be getting the average housing stock from, in Preston for example, probably somewhere from like 2 stars to 4 stars. Just low hanging fruit, nothing particularly exotic. And we also assumed as a design consideration that 95% of all our energy must come from renewable energy. So that means that when diesel generators are running, over the course of a year, they provide no more than 5% of the energy. On a couple of the particular community designs that we landed on, it was most cost effective to actually have 98 or 99% from renewables, which was really interesting. Now what's really important to note is that when we did our cost analysis, because we're not just hippies who pull numbers out of there and say this sounds like a good idea, we did a really rigorous analysis of the net present value of all the different situations using different weighted average cost of capital that was consistent with what networks use and everything, and all of the actual costs of what I've described above, including the energy efficiency improvements and household modifications, and including obviously all of the system itself, and even including buying back the asset value from the distributor for the portion of the grid that they no longer control anymore. All of that was taken into account in our costing. And even when you take all that into account in the costing, what we found was that for homes that have another source for space heating, such as gas or wood, where they were going to use that other source for space heating anyway, it's cost effective today in some cases and before 2020 in others for those communities to go off grid with the technology designs that we have. So based on considering, taking into account every cost you could possibly, that an economist could possibly throw at this and say, but what about? It's more cost effective today for a home, or for a community of homes to go off grid. Either an existing home, an existing community, such as that in Preston, or a new greenfields community. It is a big caveat to say they also require space heating from gas or another source, but that's just what it is at the moment. So there were a few questions before. Do we have anyone who hasn't asked a question yet? Anyone wants to ask a question? Yep.
You talk about gas turbines or diesel generators. Why haven't you considered importing big power from an electric source? Is that a political?
From the existing grid.
Mm-hmm.
From the existing grid.
Yeah.
Because we're disconnected from it. So it's a really good question, and raises.
If you're only importing 5 to 10%.
The principle's around being disconnected.
Yeah, but yeah. Having a dirty generator running in a residential zone is not a great thing to have.
Yeah. So the problem is this: you don't just have a part-time grid connection, because the distribution business needs to maintain the safety and reliability of a bit of network, regardless of whether it's used for 1 hour a year or 8,760 hours a year. So if you're only using it for 50 hours a year for backup, you still have to pay the full supply for your distribution network costs through some mechanism to use it, to have it there for when you need it. So this model only works, and this is why the Malakuta one's an interesting one. So in Malakuta, SP AusNet really desperately doesn't want to actually lose their grid connection, because then they lose a lot of revenue and some of their regulated asset base. However, the best cost-effective option for supplying Malakuta would be without the distribution network there. So, and to use it part-time, basically one way of looking at it is this. There can be lots of different motivations for removing the distribution network. What we're talking about here is one where there's a cost motivation because it's a cheaper way to do it. Another motivation, and this is something that's come out of bushfire management, for example, is the idea that you shut down the distribution network during high fire risk days. Now, the analysis that we did shows that if you're going to do that and shut down a grid for something like 2 sequential days, at least once a year, if you're building a backup power supply to do that, that's not just a diesel generator, it's actually more cost effective just to remove the grid altogether because of the amount of storage that you need. So it's similar logic when you say, okay, well, what are our potential backup sources for when the sun's not shining enough? And one of those is potentially remaining connected to the grid, but then the economics of the whole thing don't stack up, because you've both got an entirely more or less reliable local supply and a reliable grid supply as well.
Well, that's essentially what you're trying to demonstrate, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, there was another question up the back.
So 450 houses with PV set up, does each house have its own grid connect inverter?
Yep, so that's a really good question. What sort of inverters have we used?
Yeah, there's a real issue with 450 inverters close together trying to out-compete each other.
Yeah, so this is interesting. So we're talking there about the control of inverters. Now, there are, in our system, there are probably 500, maybe a bit over 500 inverters, maybe a bit under. We've got 450 inverters for our solar grid connect, and they're all just naturally grid connect inverters. All of the issues that you have with inverters out competing each other can be fixed through programming, theoretically. Well, no, actually in practice, they're not, because inverters are designed to work in a grid connected environment. What we've assumed is that we've got normal grid connect inverters for our solar, we've got quite expensive interactive inverter chargers for our batteries. And those batteries have also, in some homes you'd have both solar and batteries, and you'd probably have your solar in those homes going straight into the interactive inverter charger as well. So what we assumed was that between the smarts in our, that we've allowed for in our overall system controller, the smarts that are already in our smart inverters, and we've assumed that we can use, there's some sort of VAR control or some minor control capacity in the grid connect inverters that means that we don't have any issues there with voltage and so on.
What average consumption did you, per house per day, did you?
I think after our efficiency improvements, we're down to about 12-ish kilowatt hours per day. So it's pretty conservative. We're not living in the dark.
Those 4 hot days in January, I think it was, are really fit. Some suburbs were up around an average per house of like 40 kilowatt hours, which I find incredible. But
Lovely because we've got solar, there's also a bit more sun during those times as well. Another thing and that brings up an important point. We did a very pretty rigorous design, as we tend to for these things, and we assumed we used real solar data for, I can't remember how many years, and as well as we created out of our load profiles, it's all flooding back to me now, that question of the load profiles that we used and the ones in Preston, we actually built into those additional diversity as well, so that we took the, the average smoothish load profile that was there and threw some diversity in it just in case the load varied by more than we expected it to, for whatever reason. So we've got all the natural diversity of solar and the natural diversity of the load. And we still found during the summer months we never came close to needing to switch on those generators. And that was even assuming the heat waves and so on. In fact, the batteries never got below 70% full in summer months. So there's a lot of room for those heat waves in this system. It's the winter months where you start to need to turn on the generator.
so did you for a heat wave like that?
We just found we didn't need to, because the data that we used would have included at least one heat wave or two, because it was based on real data. We could have. Just trying to think. I can't remember what the actual factor was that we allowed for the highest consumption in relation to the average for given months, but I'd say it wouldn't have quite accounted for a heat wave like that. But given that we still had 70% battery storage at the worst case in summer, in the worst heat wave, we could double it again and still not run out of battery storage. So, it would definitely accommodate that heat wave.
So it's those 40 kilowatt hour suburbs are probably all one-star houses. That's part of that. That's why they're using so much.
Tell us about the Sandringham house.
The numbers we got from the Sandringham looking at the numbers was 34 kilowatt hours. And it doesn't want to be one star, but something.
Did you?
There are a couple of hands that have been going up over here, and I've been ignoring that side of the room a bit. So let's hear from Brad.
Craig, I just wanted to know, when you said that the system's cost effective now, based on if you had heating from gas or another source. I don't, you may have mentioned it, but water heating as well, or space heating?
Just space heating.
So you're assuming possible heat pumps for hot water or solar hot water or something like that? Okay.
Yep.
But at least boosted.
We've assumed heat pumps all the way.
Yep.
Now what's interesting too is that if you have even if you have gas heating, there's actually an additional energy saving that we haven't taken into account, in that you could reduce your actual gas usage, because if you've got electric split system air cons, during probably 80% of the year, 70% of the time you do need some heating, there would potentially be a bit of reserve in the battery system, or the battery network, to use, for some consumers, to use a bit of their split systems for heating instead, and reduce the overall gas consumption. So there's a benefit there that we haven't factored into the model because it's complex, but it helps make it conservative. Another question from over there?
If the residents gradually replace their internal combustion engine vehicles with electric vehicles over the next 10 years or so, does the Standalone grid need to be changed much to accommodate that?
Yeah, you just add a few more solar panels as you need to and more battery banks as you need to. That's one of the nice things about this particular type of arrangement. When you've got an energy network and you've got a supply constraint like that, you've got a step change in investment required. Like you have to upgrade a feeder or something at a cost of many millions of dollars. However, with a microgrid like this, there's no single part of the network that becomes overly constrained. In theory, we actually, just for reasons that aren't that interesting, we don't have a lot of spare capacity in our generators. And that's because it's very rare that the generators will have to supply all of their load themselves. So the generator capacity as it is now in our example system is based on pretty much exactly our actual peak demand for the year, maybe even a tiny bit under, because it's extremely unlikely it would ever have to meet that. The reason we've got 2 or 3 generators is because most of the time you'll never have to run more than one of them anyway to charge the batteries or top them up on those days. So if in the case that you described, you had a whole lot of electric vehicles added on and they all switched on, they weren't controlled to be used at night, and they were just being used during evening when the sun stopped shining, but everyone's come home from work and plugged their cars in, and you've drove up the peak quite dramatically. They'd have to probably install quite a few of them before we needed to upgrade the inverters, but we might need to install another backup generator, just in case. Or, and we definitely, because of increased energy use, you'd need more solar and batteries. But all of those things are basically modular. So, it's not like you'd need an additional step change. And if you have a user-pays system, whereby there's a limit to how much energy a householder can use before the amount that they pay goes up by a certain amount, then you can accommodate that with no worries. Someone can choose to put in an electric vehicle and just pay the difference for it. Yeah, you had a question as well?
Yeah, it was related to long-term maintenance and replacement of equipment. Was that all sort of factored in?
Yep. So we were pretty conservative on that too. We assumed that we had highly paid people with toothbrushes cleaning the solar panels every 2 weeks. No, we were careful to make sure that we didn't, in the real world, we'd have potentially some cleaning of panels, sorry, when I say the real world, in today's world, where people own their own solar panels, you assume that some people clean some of them themselves. However, in this case, our consumers are paying for energy services. They're not necessarily paying for they're not responsible for the performance. So we've actually assumed professional services to go and do routine checks and inspections, unscheduled and scheduled maintenance, and all of that stuff.
So take into account the asset management of the power lines as well, or?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. So there was a bit of an oversight in our analysis. We did include asset management of power lines, but guess what we overlooked? In fact, if anyone in the next, it relates to power lines, if anyone in the next 6 minutes can guess what it was we overlooked that relates to power lines.
Tree trimming?
No, we did our vegetation control.
Possums.
Possums.
No, there was a question over.
I think I know what it is.
Yeah?
Paying the original electricity supplier as some sort of compensation.
We did that. We paid them 30% of the undepreciated asset value. Yeah. We told them, here's your money, bugger off.
I don't know the answer to the question.
Before we go to questions, someone over there has had one, and we'll come back to you next. Yep.
Yeah, I've got a query about the lithium batteries. I've heard that they can be quite unstable with the research that developed as you're applying.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. I'm not a battery expert, but these are ones that are being used in electric vehicles now. And so I've assumed that means that they're probably going to be safe enough to use in a domestic environment if they're safe enough to put in an electric vehicle.
we used in aeroplanes too.
And
My question was about, you know, have you looked at scaling of this, like both upwards and downwards, like getting 500 homes is hard. What's the point where you come down? Is it 100 homes, is it 10 homes, is it 50? Or
it's a really good question. And the two cases that we've analysed is 500 homes and 1 home. And it's a piece of string. I'd say that my guess, and it's just a guess, is that anything above about 100 homes would use basically the same model at a similar scale to the 500 home one. What it is reliant on, as I was alluding to before, is that your services are delivered by and the infrastructure is owned by an ESCO, so an energy services company, who has invested, who's got capital and so on, and is making a return and revenue presumably. The real scale efficiency needs to come from that being something they do at more than just one community. So no ESCO is going to go out, well, they might, it would be great if they did, but an ESCO under our model can't go out and do that profitably for just one community. There'd have to be a first one that was loss leader, guinea pig, pilot trial, whatever you want to call it. And after that, it probably wouldn't matter if a community was 50 homes or 5,000. They'd just use the same model.
Can you give us a clue what you overlooked?
Oh, that wasn't 6 minutes yet. No, it's 3 minutes to go.
Great report. Another good report was the Beyond Zero thing down there with the 100% renewables. And a key part of that was the solar thermal with the molten salt storage. Okay, that was 2010. Here we are 4 years later, still waiting for someone to do a serious study on the solar thermal with the molten salt. So I'd hate to see that happen with a report like this, where we're 4 years later and you're still going around spruiking it, saying how great it is. And so some concept of, like, as we were saying before, that maybe 10 homes or something that wouldn't be purely economic necessarily, but it would be 10 ATA enthusiasts or whatever that live in an area. Or maybe it's going to be your developer in New South Wales or something for something new build, but that would take longer.
Yeah, it'll be
but it would be fantastic if there were 5 or 10 homes someplace where people could start to do these concepts and then it could be talked about as reality. What would be the main thing stopping that, with regulations or getting an ESCO, or what would be the main thing, other than economics, stopping, say, 10 like-minded people that live close together actually trying to go down this road?
Yep. So at the moment, there is the provisions for buying back a bit of network are actually there to an extent, but they're not designed for quite this arrangement. That's okay though. The homes could buy the chunk of network off the distributor. The problem is that the distributor would basically name their price. It would probably be inflated. The only option left for those consumers to appeal that price is to go to the Australian Energy Regulator. The Australian Energy Regulator doesn't really have direct experience with this exact type of thing, so they won't have a benchmark for it. They won't necessarily give a cost-reflective determination for the consumers. So that's one thing. There's opposition from the networks, and the second thing there is that the means of recourse is quite onerous for a community that just wants to be by its own grid and be left alone. They have to deal with a lot of market institutions to do that. Another one is if there is any sale of energy, they'd need to comply with exempt selling provisions or have other arrangements in place to get around any contractual sale of energy. So obviously they're going to be a community, they're going to need a governance model if they're going to do it themselves, or something to co-own and share that asset. Otherwise it needs an ESCO to come along, and for the reasons of economics, they're only going to do it if they're either very generous or if they can make a profit out of it.
Is there anything to be learned from like Hepburn Wind as to how to make this happen?
Look, the thing, if you take probably, yeah, I mean, so one thing that this ties into, which is an area of interest for me personally, aside from the consumer advocacy stuff, in the last year or so I've been putting a lot of energy into community energy projects. We've set up a coalition of organisations that are supporting community energy projects in Australia. We're having a conference or a congress, we're calling it, in Canberra in June. Highly recommend any of you that can make it do. It's going to be really, really fun. We're developing a strategy for community energy, and we are, with Energy for the People, looking at stuff to relate to that strategy that's specifically to do with the buying back the grid scenario and this sort of arrangement. The other thing that we've done is set up, we're a founding member of the Coalition for Community Energy, which is the group of organisations that's developing that Congress. So I think that's, at that advocacy level, that's where we're targeting things to try and make this happen. At the other level, it needs people to drive actually wanting to participate in it. And that's, you know, what you were talking about, the 5 or 10 people who want to start doing it at a local community, hopefully getting up to the stage of where communities in Germany, for example, very different situation because we're talking about council-owned infrastructure, but communities in Germany who have done similar things on a much larger scale. Yep.
I live in a block of flats, and in 2010 we upgraded all our security lighting, which is when I found out at that stage we were paying $20 to $30 a year, or would be paying $20 to $30 a year for power, and in excess of $200 in fees. So since then I've been on a slow burn to go off the grid, and in the next couple of years we have to replace our balustrades, and I want to put in solar balustrades so we'll be able to generate our power. That's easy, but then we're going to need someone to service the infrastructure once we set it up, and it seems likely to me that's going to be about the same as the charges we're now paying the electricity company, and so we're not going to get any further ahead, because we actually want to make the roof into a garden. So we're not actually going to go any further ahead, because the service fees would probably be equivalent to the current fees we are charged now.
So yeah, there's a scale issue. You know, if you've got an existing refrigerator, for example, it's not cost effective to say, oh, well, I'm going to install a solar panel and an existing a little backup generator and a battery just for that refrigerator. But at a larger scale, you get the solar, you actually get the cost benefit. And that's why we went from just looking at those single home scenarios to instead saying, okay, where's it likely to actually work? And we're talking about 500 homes as a sort of starting point for that. How are we going to do this?
Right arms.
All right, Nick.
Guess at your missing price cost, is it public liability
Yes.
insurance?
Oh no! Oh, if only it stopped at public light. Public lighting.
It was going so well.
Yeah. So this is the one thing that we overlooked. So public lighting is actually a service that's provided by energy distributors, and it's actually an energy service as well, because there's energy associated with the use of those.
You meant to say this.
So I went away and did some back of the envelope calculations afterwards, and found out that there is one element of public lighting that we haven't, that we need to add something on for, and that would be some sort of a switching and notification system. But all we would need to do to accommodate the public lighting was just slap on a few more solar panels and a few more batteries, and then you recoup the additional revenue from having public lighting, which is what the distributors recoup at the moment. And I know how distributors work for finance. Chances are, if they're making a buck off it, you can make too. Doing the same thing. So,
Greenfields, LED lighting and that stuff.
well, yeah, you could actually get approval for the existing bulbs, make an efficiency improvement, or existing lights, make an efficiency improvement, and you actually get to keep the difference. It's an operational improvement.
Just one quick question. What's in it for the customer on a standalone system? What's the money saving? What's the incentive?
For what, in what case?
Against the existing system.
For the 500 home scenario?
Yeah.
It's cheaper.
What,
20%?
10%, 5%?
Oh, well, we haven't really explored that too closely.
Well, that's really important.
Well, we've identified the point where it starts to get cheaper than the grid. So what we haven't done is said, oh yeah, it'll be 4% cheaper in 2017 and it'll be 8% cheaper in 2024. That's not really so relevant. It'll be a good bit of work. But what we wanted to find is where's the crossover point. So you're right, it would be interesting.
Yeah, well,
but the other, I don't think it's even comparing apples with apples just to say that it's the same price, because if you're comparing apples and apples, you'd say, okay, what's the cost of all of those consumers on the grid accessing energy that's more reliable, because our off-grid system supplies more reliable energy than systems connected to
Yeah,
the
but
grid.
you're assuming that these are all 88 people. I mean, 85% of the population.
No, this is the opposite. This is what I'm saying. This is assuming it's not all 88 people. This is assuming that the people are getting better reliability, because the reliability you get from a standalone system is a lot higher. You're not subjected to outages in the sub-transmission and the transmission system. You're not subjected to the huge voltage variations that can occur on some parts of the electricity network, particularly regional ones. As well as that, you've got lower losses in the system, and we didn't actually separately model for that. So there's another cost benefit we didn't take into account. That'll probably pay for some lighting switches. And it's also 95% renewable energy, which compared to the national grid, which is, what, 15 maybe, or 10 or something. So, and that's for the same price. So it doesn't need to be ATA member types going in for it. They're paying the same price and getting a better service under the off-grid arrangement. So you look doubtful. What do you
Yes,
doubtful?
I'm doubtful, because the average Joe Blow doesn't give a damn where the power comes from. He just wants power. And
That's what it's modelled on.
That's what it's based on. It's based on the power being provided. That means that the one person in 10 who slams the door in your face and says, I don't want to know about it, can still continue to just pay for energy the way they always have. It means that everyone else on the system also gets a better deal, or at least it pays the same price for a better service. That's been a real key to our modelling, because the point that you make is a good one. If it's just hippie analysis, hardly anyone's going to listen. But this is about the bottom line and people's hip pockets. So we've accounted for all of those things. Question here, and then up there.
Okay, yeah, you talked about the community, the type of community, and how you can scale it and stuff. Well, the first community that springs to mind is that it's communities like this, like retirement villages, or all put solar on their retirement villages, and also big apartment developments. And any identifiable community, like for example, something based on disability, a large group area, for example, that they seem to be a natural fit to this sort of idea.
Yep.
And also the guy who talked about the 44-degree days, or the 40, however many kilowatt hours a day there was, well, all those 450 people could perhaps go to the milk bar on that particular day and use the air, fully accredited air conditioning
The local pool that can't afford air.
That's
That would be a nice place to be. One point that relates to what you're saying, which is actually really important, where it does become viable, particularly for a community that is not directly in the 500 home model, but also potentially some that are, is when this is an alternative to upgrading a bit of network that needs to be upgraded anyway. And this was another key finding of ours. If you've got to spend, $10,000 or whatever it is per home to upgrade the supply to an existing community, then it's cheaper to just take them off grid, even if you don't have gas in that case. Oversizing the system so that you've got a bit of extra generation in summer and you've got solar panels on more surfaces can still be cheaper than the cost of upgrading the network and still offer that benefit on balance of, greener energy and so on. Now we had another one there, and then Peter.
Two things. The first one, in response to this gentleman here and his jacket, the whole question of carbon pricing is still an open question. It's going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. Where it's going to be in 5 or 10 years' time, we don't know. So the risk involved in staying with our current technology, if the rest of the world decides that carbon pricing is the way to go, if it falls that way, there's a very big benefit to being involved in renewables. And the carbon pricing, after all, is a reflection of the pollution that's in the atmosphere. So, we're dealing with a natural force, and when is the politics going to catch up with what's happening in nature? So that's one hidden benefit. It's just waiting for something to happen. On a technical question, your 500 homes in a place like, say, Northcote or wherever, presumably also contain several blocks of flats, unless you were consuming all standalone homes. In the cases where you've got blocks of flats, and we'll see the woman over there, the possibility is, there's another thing. there's a big wave of town planning changes happening right across Melbourne right now. You probably all know about it in your local areas. But that will also include big changes in housing density everywhere, which will go up, probably. Now, assuming that there will be blocks of flats of 10 or 20 or more, some of those installations will be able to have district heating. If there is some district heating just within that block, there's a potential for cogeneration, which means in winter, when the heating's required, you'll have an electrical input background as well. So that will be one way to provide the input that you require as a backup, because if as little as 10% are in blocks and so forth, there's the potential of getting the energy that way, I would think.
No, I think that makes sense. There's other ways of sharing energy load that don't require cogeneration, and cogeneration is a great idea in principle, but in a lot of scales it doesn't necessarily stack up economically. It's got lots of other benefits, but in the context of, say, an apartment block, for example, at the moment it doesn't compare with other options of achieving the same outcomes, like your solar and batteries in that case.
I was thinking for wintertime boosting.
Yep.
Because it would only be running in the wintertime when you want the heat.
But the other way of, so you're saying there is an alternative to gas, or as a way of using
well,
gas?
if you're proposing a separate generator to run in the wintertime when there's insufficient energy to run the grid, then
the difference is that generator is not supplying all of the heating load. It's
Right.
only supplying load for a really small number of hours and a small number of days where you've had a cloudy week, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really about, in our modelling, it's really looking at, irrespective of what the home heating requirements are, those generators are just running for, I'm trying to remember, I think we ended up with about 50 hours a year was our benchmark. And obviously the homes need more than 50 hours a year of actual heating. So I do agree with you that cogen, if it can be affordable, is going to be a good option. In the case of these arrangements, and it might actually be something that in the broader context of targeting apartments, as you say, could be the cost-effective way of dealing with a site-specific issue. So it's a good observation. Sorry, I just better take a question from Peter and then back to you.
Sure. When you made your previous point, a little alarm bell went off in my mind. You were talking about the fact that where you have a situation that the supply grid or the local infrastructure needs some expansion, it's a lot cheaper to go with this separate mini grid. The alarm bell that went off in my mind is that the existing companies love this need for infrastructure upgrade because they've got a guaranteed 7% return on investment or whatever it is, which we all pay. So how do we break that love affair thanks to the silly rulemaking that was made years ago?
Firstly, they get more than 7%. 7% is 9% is the interest rate that they're approved to get, and every time there's a difference between the interest rate they're approved for and what they actually pay in interest, every percentage difference there turns into a 5% difference on their profit margin. So you've got businesses now that have got an approved interest rate of 9.5% and they're borrowing at 6.5%, which means that they get 15% more profit than they would have if they hadn't have gamed the system. So the problem's bigger than you suggest, but you're exactly right in identifying what the problem is. One of the issues is that under the current regulations, the distribution businesses are limited in what they can actually own that's not poles and wires, and what they can claim as a genuine cost. So this is an issue that they have, for example, with buying batteries for substations to avoid the need to upgrade a substation. It's that there's limitations to what they can buy and actually claim as part of their regulated asset base. Now that can be changed with the rules. What can't be changed with the rules is the business's imperative to retain their regulated asset base. And that's why, in terms of the two options, one being buying out some of their grid, well, that's fine if you pay for it, or the other option being them taking some ownership and providing the systems for consumers, neither of those under current rules quite work for them. And that's why our approach was, well, we assumed that consumers would pay for the grid at a rate that's reasonable and reflective of the value of the grid to them. Now, did we get to
Buy
your
it
question?
outright, in other words, you mean?
Sorry?
Buy it outright.
Yep. 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 Sorry, the gentleman.
Just getting back to trying to achieve a...
Sorry, we'll go with this one up in the middle, and then back to you.
Just a question back to...
Sorry, my finger's not pointing very well. It's through no fault of my own. I've got to learn to point with my left hand.
Question on gas, back to gas. I would have thought certainly in the greenfield site that the cost of not putting in that gas infrastructure across 500 houses would also have given you a fair bit of extra money to spend on extra batteries and whatnot to support that heating. Did you do any looking at that, of actually not doing gas?
We did, and we found that there were two big constraints there. The first one was, yeah, you save money by not having gas, but you then create a demand for a huge amount of energy at a time when there's not a lot of sunshine, which is the middle of winter. So the cost of, the long-term cost of the batteries and solar and panels and everything that you need to overcome using gas is a lot higher than the cost of just using gas for that period. And this actually raises a really interesting point. We've said two really controversial things in this report, apparently. One of those is that part of the economic case is for homes that are using gas. The other one is if they're using wood for heating. Now, this isn't an advocacy document. What this is a document, it's not looking at the environmental stuff, it's not looking at us saying, hey, we should do this or we should do that. We're actually just saying in our report, looking at the economics, here's when it's going to become economically viable to do X, Y, and Z.
Yep.
So we're not saying it'd be a great idea if everyone used more gas in winter. In fact, we are kind of doing the opposite, because this would reduce people's gas load, because we're also dealing with energy efficiency and everything as part of this.
Yep.
But we have had a strong response from people who have said, hang on, you're saying people should use gas, which is something that a lot of people have got issues with. Same for wood, because a lot of people are concerned about the particulate matter from wood. And to be honest, I agree with a lot of those concerns. The type of wood burners that you need to be able to really cleanly burn wood, they work really well, but they're not widely used and they're not very even available in Australia. In fact, outside of Europe, pelletised wood burning systems aren't common, and apparently outside of a ring of about 50 kilometres around Lismore, you can't even get the pellets in Australia to have a reliable supply for them anyway.
You can get them in envelope.
So,
you can get them in envelope.
You can you? Oh, there you go. From a long-term reliable supplier? Oh, that's good to know. So, you know, as an issue, what that means is that most people, for them burning wood wouldn't be a pelletised system, it would be, you know, a combustion stove, which, yeah, is going to release particulate matter which might have, you know, health risks in some areas. For that reason, we actually completely avoided even considering the wood burning solution somewhere like Preston, so that we only consider that in the remote, in the regional area. Still presents the same issues though. So, you know, where we've looked for the sweet spots is in the most economically efficient way of doing it. And the most economically efficient way means that in Victoria at least you do need to bolster your supply with gas for heating reasons. You certainly wouldn't have to in most of Queensland though, and even in large parts of New South Wales. Or if you were talking about 8 to 10 star homes, or a whole lot of other situations. So these are all areas where our analysis has stayed conservative. And it's stayed conservative so we can wave it in front of policymakers and they can't say you're a bunch of hippies, go away. Now the other question up there,
just getting back to what I highlighted before, so trying to start with it, this is not an existing thing, a new project, right, where you're talking about over a period of time up to 4,000 or 5,000 houses, right? You're trying to achieve low cost, energy efficient, affordable housing within that. Every household would be minimum 6 stars, right? And then you have all your solar lights, free electric transport, community bakery, community laundry, electric mowers, all of those things, right?
Mhm.
And that really comes to low cost of living for all of those people. So they'll all be benefited, the whole community benefits. But trying to get this message across to people who wants to make a lot of money out of the project doesn't work.
Mm. The point you make is a really good one, and I found it really interesting for me. When I started doing energy consumer advocacy about 5 years ago, it was really interesting because I took on this role thinking, oh yeah, I'd be going out there and you know, advocating for environmentally sustainable solutions, and I'd be doing battle with all of the people who want more affordable stuff. But in that time, and even up until that time, the whole thing was changing. And in that time, things like solar have become a lot cheaper. Now solar is, you know, for a lot of people,
now. Yeah,
couldn't care about its environmental implications. It's actually an affordability matter.
But
And so part of the point that you make, which is a really good point about cost of living, when we look at a lot of these things, it's not just about you know, making people feel good about their environmental decisions. As you say, the big businesses really do put up opposition to this way of thinking, and it's consumers who would benefit from these changes, not just the environment.
The other thing we didn't mention is the cost of wastage processing. Each household use that waste, organic waste, to generate your heat. Use all the cut-offs and all the wood which is thrown away and all the chop and all that. Use all of that. So within the community, it can become sustainable and also very low cost living.
Yep, agreed. Yep.
Yeah, just curious about the lifetime of the batteries in these systems and other components. Was that taken into account in that?
Yep. So interestingly, because of that concern raised before about lithium batteries potentially having shorter life, originally when I came to this exercise, we were thinking, oh, so what are we going to derate lithium battery lives to? And when we looked a bit closer, what we found is, yeah, the issue with lithium batteries is sometimes they get triggered to have a breakdown or whatever it is. I can't remember what the chemical reaction occurs. That means that they can catch fire. That's different to a normal way that you would expect them to end their life, though. So when we looked at the asset life considerations, we started with saying, okay, and there's very equivalent things for lead acid batteries. For lead acid batteries, you say, all right, a well-maintained set of lead acid batteries should easily last for 12 years. If you size it so it doesn't discharge too much, and if you never discharge it too quickly, and if it gets its equalisation charge, and really you can even bank on getting 15 years out of it, potentially more if you're really, 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 you know, careful, but no one ever is that careful. So, you know, we might assume that you get 5 to 10 years out of a set of lead acid batteries in the real world, the way most consumers would use them, if we're using the average, not too overzealous consumer. What we found, and I spent a lot of time trying to pick apart the lithium-ion rationale, but basically they've got smart charging systems built into them. So the voltage across battery cells is automatically well balanced. They can handle a much deeper level of discharge with only performance changes, and they can handle a much higher rate of discharge, off a scale higher than lead acid. So there's just all these factors that don't impact their life. So I think we assumed, I can't remember if it was 12 years life for lithium acid batteries. It might have been 10, it might have been 15, it's somewhere in the report. But I was pretty comfortable when looking at all the aspects of that. I mean, even to say 15 years for a lead acid, for a lithium battery now, feels to me like something that is not on the conservative side. But looking at all the aspects of how they operate and what the risks are, I'm confident that they'd be.
Can I just back it up on that, Craig? I mean, there's a huge amount of R&D on batteries. I mean, the concern around that is unwarranted. I mean, massive amounts of money going. I mean, they're already talking 10-year warranties and things like that. I mean, once you do
really?
Yeah, I've just been off a few seminars and various things. I mean, they're starting to warrant those already. Imagine the life you get out of it. I mean, the concern is people always talk about batteries. That's yesterday. There's so many applications of batteries now. There's so many institutions investing for EV, all sorts of things. It'll come on board pretty as quick as PVs come down now. I don't think it's anything to be concerned about.
Most important question of the night, where do we get the report?
Well, it's been banned. I think you'll find a link to it on the ATA website. In fact, if you look at the ATA website at the moment, it's got a big banner on the front saying unplugged or something like that. It'll be easy to find from the ATA website. And it's called What Happens When We Unplug. Yeah.
Who pays for all this research? I mean, this is expensive, this sort of research.
You do. So the Consumer Advocacy Panel. The Consumer Advocacy Panel is funded by what's called market fees. Every megawatt hour of energy that's bought on the national energy market, from that 0.000 something of a cent goes to the Consumer Advocacy Panel, who has an annual budget of about $2.5 million. And that's the body that funds most of the consumer advocacy that occurs in Australia. About 10% of that ends up going to me and other people at ATA. I get funded through the Global Advocacy Program. I'm one of about 6 consumer advocates funded across Australia. So our job is to go up against the hundreds of people who work in policy for distribution businesses and retailers to try and represent consumers to make sure that our energy bills aren't higher and that we have more sustainable energy and that we're not getting ripped off by all the businesses. So yeah, it does cost a bit of money, and I think it would still be money well spent even if it had another zero on the end of it.
I couldn't agree more.
Sure. Someone at the back hasn't asked a question.
Yeah,
So let's
yeah,
go.
did you consider nickel metal ion batteries?
I don't know enough about them.
Right.
Damn.
I've
Finishing
heard
on a
about-
question I don't know the answer to.
Yeah.
You did so well.
They're fairly robust, reliable, and can last a long time. You can discharge them right down.
How do they
can last. used on forklift trucks many years ago, and they're much better on lead acid.
I don't think they have the charging efficiency at all.
Yeah, I don't think they're as efficient as the modern type lithium type batteries by any means. But they, I mean, if they can discharge, a fair bit and then get charged right back up, but if they can last the distance, like 20 or more years, then that would make them worthwhile.
So batteries are a strange balancing act because there's so many aspects and facets to them. And I'll just speak hypothetically because I don't know what the cost of those batteries are now, but let's just say they might cost twice as much as lithium, but they'll allow you to discharge to 95%. If you discharge lithium batteries to 70% and those other ones to 95%, it's still not worth the extra doubling of the cost because you're only getting, in that case, about 25 or 30% more storage. So I'm not saying that the battery technology that you're talking about doesn't work, but it would have to be pretty competitively priced to compete with lithium. And the benefits of being able to discharge it that little bit further would need to be outweighed by that cost saving.
And they're also quite recyclable, they're not toxic like lithium as well.
No, that is a really good point.
I'm conscious that people want to leave, so we'll have to wrap it up soon. So maybe we'll just do, a couple more questions.
Okay. I'll let you choose the questions.
Just a point on the batteries, there's an excellent website called Battery University. It goes into all of the different sorts of batteries and all the issues. It's really good.
Yeah, I've seen that one. It is really good. Well worth checking out. Yep.
Quick observation on the question about what kind of batteries. I don't think it matters particularly what kind of battery you chose to put in your report, use in your report or your study, as long as it's specified.
Yeah,
if it then turns out that there's a better battery, the argument to do it is even better.
I feel always.
No, that is a really good point. And that's basically the same can be said for most of the design decisions that we've made in our modelling and in the report. We've been conservative in a lot of ways. So almost everywhere that the report could be faulted for being too conservative, there's the same place you can say, well, that just means that it's more correct conclusions. And in the case of batteries, there might be other batteries that trump lithium ion. It's looking unlikely because lithium ion's got a lot behind it and a lot of potential. But if that exists, then that adds to the value of the options that are there.
Maybe we'll finish it here, and if anyone wants to talk to you.
Okay.
after which you'll be available for
I'll be available. I'm not sure how long my voice will be available.
Yeah.